Hello and welcome to the Palestine Matters podcast series. We're recording this series at the Beyond Borders International Festival at Traquair House in Scotland. Palestine Matters is a joint project of Beyond Borders Scotland and the Britain-Palestine Project. Please enjoy this episode. Welcome to the second podcast in the Palestine Matters series that we're recording here during the Beyond Borders Festival. The podcasts are a joint project of Beyond Borders and the Britain-Palestine Project. We're speaking during the Beyond Borders Festival, the day after the UN officially declared famine had started in Gaza. The level of starvation has been building over months, and there sits on the outside of Gaza 3 months' supply of food in convoys which could enter the Strip at any time if they were allowed to by the Israelis. I'm here with two former UN officials who have a wide experience of the humanitarian situation in the region, who've worked directly on these issues and also are now watching very carefully for what the UN can do, should do, in the situation that we face in Gaza. So I'm going to ask Andrew Gilmour first, to introduce himself and then speak a little bit about his views on the current situation.
Thank you so much. Well, I had 30 years in the UN, but even before that, actually, I'd had an involvement with this part of the world. I first went to Gaza, Israel, and the West Bank in 1983 in my gap year, and I've been constantly involved in it ever since, episodically. So I've had a long role. I was the Assistant Secretary of Human Rights in my last UN position, and then just very recently, in fact, last week, I was asked by UN staff, who have actually for the first time in history set up an organization. It's called UN Staff Gaza, because essentially the feeling within the UN is so dissatisfied, so angry, so powerless, not with the UN leaders who have actually spoken out very commendably. The Secretary General and many others have spoken out quite a lot on this issue. So it's not dissatisfaction with them, but with the response of the world to what we are seeing. And they asked me, as somebody who was formerly with the UN, to take on the role of chair to provide them with a bit of advice and a little bit of cover. So that is essentially my involvement with that.
And what's your view of the current situation and the role of those UN staff and the UN as an institution in terms of making a difference to what's happening now?
Well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that for the first time in history, we have a member state that is assassinating almost one by one UN staff. We've had 380 UN staff members, my former colleagues, have been killed. Many of them in their homes, along with their families, others when they're doing their UN mandated work by UN member states. And the silence that has met this mass killing. Of course, I fully understand why the world's press focus more on the absolutely unprecedented killing of journalists as well. I get why there's a solidarity of journalists to focus on that, but it's certainly one of the reasons I took on this assignment was to draw attention to the killing of UN staff, which is just an unbelievable thing to happen, and the fact that the UN, the key member states, are not objecting to that. So of course the UN staff they're angry, and they're seeing how they're trying to find ways that they can channel their feelings about this injustice. I think they feel, and I would say, since I'm much older than all of them, these are mainly young staff actually who have joined relatively recently, that there has been nothing in my lifetime like this. And I think the repercussions are going to be with us and with the younger generation for a very long time. I don't really see how international law comes out of this, in fact. The way Western powers have tried to pour scorn on the International Court of Justice and on the International Criminal Court and everything else really to do with this. The way the rest of the world is going to say to the Western countries who've stood by, who the hell are you to ever give us lectures on anything again? So I think that we are at a moment, and we can come to this in a second, I don't want to hog the debate, where we're going, and we're in a really, really desperate situation now. We're on the cusp of the Israeli military, late August as we are now, going into Gaza City, which is the last remaining bit that they haven't systematically destroyed, and going into the West Bank as well. And then I just don't see what's left for even the vague possibility of a two-state solution or anything like that after that, which is of course the aim of what the Israelis are trying to do. So maybe I should be...
Let's come back to the two-state solution in a moment. But Andrew Whitley, in addition to being the chairman of the Britain-Palestine Project, you also have a distinguished career within the UN structure, particularly with UNRWA. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit about how important the role of UNRWA is and what's happened to it at the moment.
Absolutely. Well, I share my fellow Andrew's anger and barely suppressed frustration over the current situation, which is indeed intolerable. There's no other word for it. And unprecedented. We have to use those words. The fact that governments are doing so little to stop this continuing. In my case, this is very personal. I have been involved with the Palestinian issue since 1985, just a little bit shorter than my colleague. When I first went out there as a journalist with the Financial Times covering the first Intifada. I remember following that through very closely. But then later on, living in Gaza as UNRWA's Director of External Relations, many of the people have been killed, my direct former colleagues, they're my friends. I know and understand what they're going through at the moment and have received many appeals for help, which I feel helpless at not being able to respond adequately to be able to do so. So as someone who has been working in the humanitarian field in different places, Kosovo, East Timor, others, I cannot say that there has been anything quite like this, whereby a member state has been able to get away so flagrantly and has not concealed what it's trying to do. It has not attempted to hide what it's doing in any way. You asked about UNRWA. Yes, UNRWA has been in the gun sights of the Israeli government and many of its people for a very long time. It's a thorn in their side. It's a reminder that the refugee issue has not gone away, and it tells them that this is their guilty conscience at work again. Because I do believe that the original expulsion of the Palestinians was part of the original sin of the birth of Israel, which they have attempted to disguise and to cover over. We've seen in the film that the Britain-Palestine Project recently made that at the beginning, Israel's admission to the United Nations was conditional on it dealing with the refugee question. It did nothing about it, zero. And it's attempted at every stage to obfuscate and to bury that particular issue. So UNRWA, despite being technically a humanitarian and development agency, capacity building in the jargon, in practice is an organization that helps to keep the Palestinian refugee issue alive. And that is why Israel has been seizing this opportunity to do its best to try to force the collapse of this agency, politically and financially. It hasn't got there yet, but it's really facing a very difficult time.
I mean, the Israeli argument on this is that of the 16,000 UNRWA employees, many of them are members of Hamas, and therefore, in their view, they are legitimate targets, and they have a ratio for the number of acceptable civilian targets that can be killed at the same time if you hit one member of Hamas. So if somebody working for UNRWA is accused of being a Hamas member, they are seen by the Israelis as legitimate targets.
I think it's a false argument. Palestinians are an inherently political people. They're deeply politicized in their fibers of their being. Many Palestinians are members of different parties. Hamas is being picked upon here and selected as being the epitome of evil here. But Palestinians who work for UNRWA have also been members of other political parties, some of which have been treated as terrorist organizations by the Israeli government. So I'm afraid that this is an argument which really doesn't stand up to close examination. Possibly some of the UNRWA staff were Hamas members. That is their private privilege to be able to do so, provided that they don't cross the lines in their professional roles that they did. And I think that UNRWA responded properly by investigating those who had taken part in the 7th of October attacks and being able to punish those who did.
Could I follow up on that? This, because you're right to raise this issue, because it is indeed, it lies underneath the Israeli excuse for killing all the journalists and all the UN staff and all the rest of the population. And let us not bury under the carpet that just this week, a former Israeli intelligence chief said it's okay to kill 50 people for every one person who died on October the 7th. And then he added, as if that wasn't a genocidal enough remark, he then said, and it doesn't matter if they are children. So that, and all this is somehow because they are all Hamas. And it is, it's constantly been the line. Now, in February 2024, or March, I think, 4 months after the war started, the Israelis chose the day that the ICJ did their court preliminary ruling that there was a clear and present danger of genocide, essentially. But in order to bury the coverage of that, they chose that day to release that 15 members of UNRWA, which is 0.01% of the task force, 0.01% of the staffing, they said were Hamas. Months later, they had still not given the information about these people. And yet, the British government, the Tory government at that point, to its lasting shame, chose that day, which was, I can remember, after 112 straight days of Israeli bombardment, the British decided to choose that day to cut off all aid to UNRWA, to a population that even at that point, that same week, the World Food Programme had said 80% of the world starving are Gazans. But the British decided to run with this hare started with the Israelis, that somehow UNRWA staff were Hamas, even though there was only a tiny, tiny proportion, and even though they never actually had the evidence in order to back that up. And even though that they were the Israeli, it couldn't have been UNRWA's fault, because after all, they don't do all the background checks. They don't have the electronic surveillance. They don't have the spying. They don't actually torture other prisoners in order to extract information. All these things that the Israelis do. So the Israelis have far more information about who is Hamas and who isn't. But they decided to use that in order to punish the whole Gazan population.
Yes.
So it's a deliberately false scare in order to try to justify. But the fact, as I said, even now, 22 months on, they're still saying it's okay to kill 50 civilians, including children, or even if they're all children, it's okay, as long as you might be able to get one Hamas at that time. And this is, I'm sorry, when it does come to whether a determination of genocide, remarks like that are going to be absolutely up there as to help guide the decision. And I have no doubt which way the decision is going to be. Yeah. And may I go back a little bit? In 1994, as a junior staff member, I was a note taker in the Security Council consultations during the Rwanda genocide. I went through, it was a rather painful experience, I have to say. Day after day, I went in to the Security Council in New York and to these behind closed doors, it wasn't a public meeting, and I heard the British, French and American ambassadors say, sorry, no, it's not genocide, this. No. Day after, no, it's not genocide, despite the evidence we were giving them. Of course, later, they all said, oh, frankly, sorry, it was genocide. But never again. But what I might say in defense of those people then was that the information we, Secretariat, could give them in 1994, there was like one cable a day. Yeah. I mean, there was none of the iPhone, there was none of the footage.
Every day.
This is genocide taking place 24 hours 7 on the world's cameras, and it's been going on for 22 months. There's no comparison. It was shameful what happened in 1994 on the part of the international community, claiming it wasn't genocide. And the reason why they didn't admit it was because if they said it was genocide, they would then be, under the terms of the Genocide Convention, they would be obliged to take action to stop it. So they said, no, it's not genocide. We don't think it is genocide, actually. And then only later did they admit it. And this is what's going to happen now. Yeah. But as I said, they don't even have the plausibility of saying we didn't know. They do know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that raises a fundamental point. As we've discussed many times in the Britain-Palestine project, the plausible case of genocide is actually sufficient under the convention to require state parties to the convention to prevent. The convention is the prevention and punishment of genocide. Now, Andrew, let's explore this a little bit, because the genocide and the dimensions of the genocide include the famine. How has the famine been created?
It's entirely man-made, entirely avoidable. It is deliberately done as a weapon of war. There is no ambiguity about that. And it's a continuation of past policies. I can well remember the former president's, the former Israeli Prime Minister Sharon's advisor Dov Weissglas saying, we're going to put the Palestinians on a diet and they will get hungry. It's a deliberate policy that has been maintained consistently
over 2007.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And then since then, the logic of the blockade was we're going to keep the Palestinians hungry and dependent on us, and weak and dependent on the international community, and drip feed them little bits of aid. They've just intensified that logic. That's all.
And more than intensified it. I mean, it's now a feeling of revenge. And generals, I mean, including one that I used to have a lot of respect for, General Giora Island, they're very, very explicit. Look, in the same way as if we were fighting Nazi Germany, there's no reason why we shouldn't blockade the population of all food. And if they starve to death, that's the product of war. They're now being very explicit on this.
But they're not blockading all food. And I'd like to explain a little bit, if you could, how the aid distribution system was working before and how it's working now, and how this new humanitarian foundation run by American military contractors has replaced the UN distribution of food, and also how that relates to the concentration. One of the stages of genocide is the concentration of a population prior to annihilation. And there's a concentration going on within Gaza now.
Well, the underlying intent here, which we haven't spoken about until now, is to be able to force the displacement of the population. It's to force them to leave the territory. And there's plenty of evidence that Israel is actively looking for other places for them to move to. Obviously, the population is desperately trying to avoid that at all costs. 100,000 or so have moved to Egypt mainly for medical reasons, or those who were able to pay to be able to get out, and it was a big payment they had to make. But nevertheless, the fact is that the pressure for them to be displaced permanently from this territory, and therefore ethnically cleansed from it, and potentially for that land to be resettled by Jewish settlers, is something that we can't ignore. It's part of the context. So there is a logic behind what they're doing of trying to kettle, to use the British policing expression, of Palestinians into a little confined area and then make life intolerable for them to do so. But you asked about the former aid distribution method in the past. It was mainly done by UNRWA, but the World Food Programme was also a very important actor here. But it's UNRWA that was responsible through its health clinics and through its social security programs for helping those in need. But why are they in a situation where they are in need to begin with? Palestinians are perfectly capable of being able to stand on their own feet. Gaza is a society of entrepreneurs. And before this conflict broke out in its latest phases, Gazans were able to trade, to be able to bring in goods from Israel, and were perfectly self-reliant. They've been forced into this situation since the election of Hamas, and then the subsequent fight between Hamas and Fatah and the expulsion of Fatah, with the West taking sides, I have to point out here, to be able to support the party that had lost the election.
And in 2006.
In 2006, correct. And that led then to the blockade that was imposed in mid-2007 on Gaza. And that logic has been maintained since then. So during that period, from 2007 onwards, up to 2023, with the October events, you had a period where the Israelis would tighten and loosen the screw to be able to allow different quantities of goods into the territory. But I think we need to go beyond just talking about food, because the other essential element of life is water. And I think we can't overlook the fact that the Israelis have deliberately destroyed the underground water aquifers, deliberately. by putting salt and chemicals and other things into the water to make the terrain uninhabitable. And that creates even greater sense of dependence, not sense, reality of dependency, on outsiders to be able to send in trucks of water, in this case Israel, or some from Egypt, for the essentials of life, never mind electricity, which also comes in primarily from Israel. So all of the basic elements of life beyond food, which is clearly one of the basics, have been denied to this population or reduced to such a tiny amount that now, as has been reported in recent days, we're on the verge, or we are actually entering into a real famine, whereby the small numbers that have been of the weaker members of the population who have been dying of malnutrition are now growing, and it's going to grow exponentially in the coming days and weeks.
So this is a human-created famine. And if we look at it as a project, therefore one of the targets was to destroy the UN presence, to destroy the distribution systems, to politicize, to try and make a political case against UN agencies. They're not alone in this, though, Israel. They're only allowed to do this because they are in step tune with the American government and have been. So how do we come back from this? How do we get back to a situation in which, firstly, the aid is distributed, which is sitting there, as we've said, 3 months' worth of food outside? But politically, how do we get back to a situation in which the UN can actually just do its job, its humanitarian job?
In pure political terms, the only way this is going to happen would be if the Trump administration suddenly changes its mind and decides to put pressure on Israel. We have the US Ambassador Mike Huckabee giving absolutely full-on defense and even saying, I mean, he tweeted this morning after the UN statement on famine that the Hamas took all the food and ate it and have become corpulent. Is that sort of level of intellect and nastiness? And denying all the footage we see of starving children and pretending that they don't exist, or somehow it's nonsense. At the moment, I see very little chance, but I would like to see the Europeans act as they are doing on Ukraine, collectively going in, as giving, quite rightly, full support to Zelensky, going over to Washington with him, and try to get the Americans, or at least, if the Americans aren't on board, to greatly up the scale of pressure on Israel. With the UK still doing a lot of stuff, supplying stuff for the F-35 weapons, giving him intelligence from RAF, spy planes, I mean, and many other forms, and frankly not backing the ICC or the ICJ.
Allow me to jump in here, because I think the point that you're making about the role of the Europeans needs to be examined further in greater depth, because the Europeans have not just left it to the Americans to deal with. They have consciously opted out of what their obligations are under the EU-Israel Association Agreement and its human rights clause. They've opted out of that. And the fact that the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policies went to Israel in order to be able to try to persuade them to allow more aid in, got an empty promise out of it, and on the basis of an empty promise that was never fulfilled, she came back and said, well, there's no need to proceed with the suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement. This might sound technical, but it actually matters, because the EU is by far the largest trading partner for Israel. The EU has never used its economic weight, which could make a real difference, independent of Washington. I agree with Andrew that Washington is the decisive actor here, but the EU has consciously given away the cards that it could play.
So why?
Political reasons.
I mean, the High Representative is not the High Representative, but the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has the German perspective on this, which is essentially, by the way, I just spent the last 5 years living in Berlin, and I've seen very upfront and far too personal quite how the Germans have reacted on Israel. To be very frank, I was convinced that, and I go around the world saying how Germany was marvellous, it had really learned the lessons of the Second World War. That's because I thought the lessons they'd learned was we don't like war crimes. We were terribly guilty, and we are recognising that. But that's not the lesson the Germans learned. But it only took me until October 23rd to realise that. The lesson they learned is we will support Israel whatever they do. And actually, after 55,000 officially have been, 60, over 60,000
And it's many more,
and now
really.
it's way, way more, because they're not counting any of the people
All those who are buried under the rubble.
And have you seen the rubble? How many are going to be in
Yes.
that? It could be twice, three, 4, 5 times as much. And so now the Germans are slightly being difficult, but they're still not, they haven't joined the French and the British, who haven't gone very far either, but at least they've said they're going to recognise Palestine. And the Germans haven't gone that far even. So
But just actually, because even those countries which we celebrate of having done a lot have not done very much.
absolutely.
And not done as much as they could have done under international law. And why does this impunity exist for Israel compared to other perpetrators? If you look at the sanctions regime against Russia from the United Kingdom and the EU, it's infinitely stronger than the sanctions regime against the State of Israel.
Let me start that, and then I'll be interested to hear what Andrew has to say. I think it's a mixture of factors here. There's a little bit of residual guilt over the Holocaust, which gives Israel a pass and says we really can't push them because of the Holocaust. I think that there is realpolitik at work here, which is the tight security relationships, which are not talked about very much, but the close intelligence relationships with the Mossad on security in many parts of the world. There are trading relationships which are considered more important here. And then there is, let's talk about it openly, a Zionist lobby. There is an active Zionist lobby which affects the major parties in this country and in others, and is really very hard and successfully at work trying to convince politicians to be able to support their cause.
And what's the big change, I think, over the last 10 years is that Israel has now become an absolute cause of the far right. And this was not the case before. Now we have MAGA, we have the AfD in Germany, who despite their anti-Semitic antecedents, or perhaps because of them, are overwhelmingly pro-Israel. I mean, they are just extraordinary. You have Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, you have Maloney, you have Farage, you have the Le Pen, every far right-wing movement, Viktor Orban in Hungary, every far right party in Europe actively supports the most hardline Israeli policy, and that is new.
So neither of you would blame the Islamist terrorist campaigns of Al-Qaeda or any mistakes on the Arab side or the Palestinian side?
No, I did totally would not accept that. Of course, there are many mistakes, but I don't think that is why this is happening, because even though we accept, and I know Andrew Whitley, as well as I do, regard October the 7th as a single act, one of the great abominations of our lives, actually, and there was absolute savage cruelty was carried out, but this does not justify even twice as many Palestinians getting killed, let alone 40 or 50.
No, I wasn't.
I know you're not saying that, but I'm saying it's gone so beyond that. I don't think one can just say. But you're right. I have actually heard people who were more open to sympathy with the Palestinians saying, "Oh, well, I've changed my mind because of October the 7th." Which so there is that. And of course, the Palestinians have made every mistake in the book, and all the Palestinians, not just Hamas. Yeah. Fatah, as Andrew said, I mean, they lost elections in 2006, and they are seen as corrupt, and many other things as well. The Palestinians are not well represented by their leaders, and they never have been, starting from the Mufti in the Second World War.
Security. Sorry,
I want to follow on that point, because I think this is quite important, is that we speak about the factors which have led up to October the 7th and subsequently, but there is a continuity that has been happening here. And what is really interesting is that the public opinion, and Andrew is right to talk about it as having become a left-right issue, but since the 7th of October, population as a whole has awoken to the issue. And we can't ignore the fact that what October 7th did, horrendous though the actions were, is put the Palestinian issue back onto the world's political map and world public opinion, that it matters again. Because for decades, and I'm sure you will agree with me, the issue was treated as something that was too difficult to deal with. We just manage it. We keep the lid on the pressure cooker. We're not going to actually try to resolve this issue. And we had complacent politicians, Palestinian politicians in Ramallah, who simply said, we just want to keep things going and preserve our position.
Yes, but I think that's right. But I think what you talked about earlier on was the Firstly, the development of the security relationships between Israel and Western states. And secondly, the way this has become a far-right issue. Both of those things are because of a common perceived enemy, that enemy being Islamism.
Yes.
And so it's Islamophobia which is at the root of the way in which Israel has positioned itself with these allies.
You're giving too much credit. The enemy is not Islamism, the enemy is Muslims. And it is in these people's eyes. If it was Islamism, we could all get behind that, because Islamism generally is seen as extremist and potentially violent, and we're anti that, obviously. And the fact is, though, for many people, it's a deep, deep distaste of Muslims. Okay. And that, I think, it partly explains why you'd get these racist movements, the AfD builders, who frankly are not very pro-Semitic either. They don't like Jews much either. Yeah. But what they really hate is Muslims. Yeah. And it's not because of Islamists, it's that they hate Muslim culture.
Yeah,
I have to agree.
And immigrants. That's what they're really worried about. And it's so. I don't think that is necessarily the impetus for this. I absolutely agree that it reinforced in some people's mind, October the 7th did, how bloodthirsty Arabs are in some forms of popular culture. But I don't think that it explains why generally it is seen as okay. One of the things that we are seeing, because it's not just far right as well, of course, there is this fear we've seen in the Labour Party very, very much, as a reaction to Corbyn. We must not be seen as anti-Semitic, and that has been used very much by people who support Israel to the limit, by saying that if you suggest anything is wrong, then you are anti-Semitic, and that has been played even in the Labour Party. So it's not just the far right.
Right. And just to wrap, and with a final question: given all this, do we need to look to the global South, to the Muslim world, to take a leadership role in rebuilding or reforming the UN? We began the conversation talking about the role of the UN and the way back, and we said, until Trump has gone, nothing can be done, and so on. But maybe other countries also have in the global South could take a lead to get hold of those institutions and make them stronger.
They already are doing, and they are acting through, for example, the Hague Group of countries. And the Hague Group represents a broad and diverse group of countries from the global South who indeed have reacted to what Andrew rightly described as the horror and shock at the hypocrisy of the West over how it has treated the Gaza crisis and the Palestinian question more broadly, with a reaction to the sheer hypocrisy of us attempting to lecture other countries about human rights. I'm afraid that Britain's standing is very low in many parts of the world. So yes, there is a reaction as part of the fragmentation of the old power blocks and the changes in the realignment of countries, whereby there are new social groups working across borders, including Palestinians working with other activist groups in different parts of the world, in South America, in other parts of Africa. And there are also governments which are attempting to do this. Not terribly successfully so far, but it is coming, and there is a coalition of action. I think you see this in the Security Council debates, which I follow fairly regularly, and it's 13, 14 to 1 all the time. And the vehemence with which many countries from the global South are speaking about the way in which the major Western countries, particularly Britain and the United States, have allowed these actions to go ahead and taken very little or no action to prevent them, reflect the real feelings of their populations.
Andrew? Okay. Thank you very much, Andrew. And that concludes the second podcast. Some hope expressed that perhaps it is the moment for the Global South to step up in this current international crisis. So thank you both for taking part in the second podcast in this series.